Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
Imagine spending 3 decades scrubbing floors in your own home, watching your siblings jet off to college on daddy's dime while you scrape by on waitress tips, all because they whispered you were just adopted, like it was a dirty secret. Then, at a rainy funeral for the only grandparent who ever treated you like family, a slick lawyer slips you a folder that flips your world upside down. You weren't adopted, you were stolen as a toddler from a life of luxury. And get this, your real folks have a $91 million pot of gold waiting if you just say the word. But what if claiming it means torching the only life you know, and the people who raised you turn out to be the villains? Stick around, because this isn't just my story, it's the kind of twist that makes you question everyone you've ever trusted. I stood there in the drizzling rain outside the old Episcopal church in suburban Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your business, but pretends they don't. Clutching a damp umbrella as the casket of my grandfather Harold lowered into the ground with that final, mechanical whine that always sounds too impersonal for someone who shaped your world. At 45, I'd long accepted my role in the Jenkins family as the invisible glue holding things together. The one who cooked the holiday meals without complaint and folded laundry for my younger brother and sister even after they moved out and started their fancy lives funded by mom and dad's endless generosity that somehow never extended to me. They called me the family maid half-jokingly, but it stung every time, a reminder that I was the adopted odd one out, shipped in at 3 years old to fill some gap they never explained, while my siblings, Tommy and Lisa, got the royal treatment, private schools, European vacations, the works. Grandpa Harold was the exception, slipping me extra cash for community college and whispering that I was tougher than they gave me credit for, but now he was gone. And the crowd of somber relatives milled about like they were waiting for the after-party invite I knew wouldn't come my way. As the service wrapped up and folks shuffled toward their cars, a man in a crisp navy suit approached me, his face lined like an old newspaper, introducing himself as Mr. Elias Grant, the family lawyer who'd handled Grandpa's estate for decades. He shook my hand firmly, his grip surprisingly warm against the chill, and leaned in close enough that I caught the faint scent of aftershave mixed with cigar smoke, murmuring words that hit me like a freight train barreling through a quiet night. "Sarah, you were never adopted, you were kidnapped," he said, his voice barely above the patter of rain on leaves, eyes darting to ensure no one overheard. My stomach dropped, the world tilting as if the ground under my sensible black flats had turned to quicksand, because for 30 years I'd built my identity on that adoption story, the one mom told with a sigh about how they'd rescued me from some orphanage hardship. He pressed a manila folder into my numb fingers, thick with yellowed pages that rustled like dry bones, and added softly, "Your real parents have been searching for you since the day you vanished. The reward for your return now stands at $91 million. 91 million, numbers like that belonged in lottery dreams or Wall Street scandals, not the life of a divorced waitress scraping by in a one-bedroom apartment off Route 40, but there it was, staring back from the top clipping dated 1985. A grainy photo of a toddler with my exact hazel eyes beaming from a missing child poster headlined, "Heiress abducted from park." I stumbled to my car, the folder burning a hole in my coat pocket, rain streaking the windows as I drove the familiar 20 minutes back to my place in Akron, the wipers slapping rhythm like a heartbeat gone haywire. Inside, I bolted the door and spread the contents across my kitchen table, the fluorescent light casting harsh shadows on headlines screaming "Billionaire's daughter snatched," "Massive reward offered," and articles detailing how little Emily Hargrove, age 3, had disappeared from a playground in upscale Greenwich, Connecticut, during a family picnic. Her parents, tech mogul Richard Hargrove and philanthropist wife Margaret, offering everything from private jets to psychics in a desperate hunt that never quit. The clippings piled up, year after year, the reward climbing from 50,000 to millions as their fortune grew through Hargrove Industries, that name ringing a vague bell from business news I'd skim while folding napkins at the diner. My hands trembled flipping Through police reports mentioning a suspicious couple seen near the park, a blue sedan with Ohio plates, Ohio, my home state, and a composite sketch of a woman who looked eerily like a younger version of my mom, Evelyn Jenkins, with her sharp chin and pinback hair. Was this some cosmic joke, or the key to why I'd always felt like a puzzle piece jammed into the wrong box? Why Dad's hugs felt obligatory and Lisa's barbs about my charity case status cut deeper than they should. Humor crept in as I paced the linoleum, chuckling bitterly at the irony. Me, Sarah Jenkins, queen of the bargain bin, potentially richer than those reality TV housewives who flaunt their designer bags on shows I secretly binge-watched after shifts. But doubt gnawed quick, because if this was true, why hadn't Mom and Dad mentioned it? And what kind of monsters would keep a secret like that for 3 decades, treating me like hired help while Tommy got his law degree and Lisa her real estate license on their dime? I poured a stiff glass of cheap Merlot, the kind that tastes like regret but warms the edges, and dialed my best friend Carla from the diner, spilling the basics without the folder details yet. Her laughter turning to stunned silence as she urged me to call the lawyer back first thing. Sleep evaded me that night, the clippings haunting my dreams with playground swings creaking in the wind and a little girl's cry echoing unanswered. The next morning, as I sipped burnt coffee and stared at the mess, my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. Family dinner tonight at the house, don't be late, maid service required. Normally I'd grit my teeth and go, but something snapped. A spark of that impending revenge flickering as I typed back a cheery reply promising my famous apple pie, then spent the afternoon at the grocery baking it to perfection with a hidden twist. Laxative-laced crust, mild enough for discomfort, but enough to make her squirm through tomorrow's open house showing, a petty payback for all the times she'd dumped her laundry on me without a thanks. It felt cleverly satisfying, like reclaiming a sliver of power in this upside-down world. But as I drove to the house that evening, folder tucked in my glove box, my phone rang with an unknown Connecticut area code. The voice on the other end hesitant and familiar in a way that chilled me to the bone. Is this Emily? We've waited so long. That voice on the phone hung up before I could respond, leaving me gripping the steering wheel in the driveway of my parents' colonial-style home. The one with the wraparound porch where I'd spent childhood summers weeding the garden while Tommy and Lisa splashed in the kiddie pool, their laughter a soundtrack to my isolation that I'd chalked up to being the responsible big sister type, even though deep down it always felt more like punishment for not fitting the mold of their perfect nuclear family dream. The dinner invitation from Lisa now felt like a trap I was walking into blind. The folder's secrets weighing heavier than the pie cooling on the passenger seat with its vengeful ingredient, a small comfort, amid the whirlwind of questions battering my mind like hail on a tin roof during one of those Midwest storms that roll in without warning and leave everything uprooted. So I smoothed my blouse, the one I'd bought on clearance at Kohl's, because it hid the diner grease stains better than most, and stepped inside to the smell of Mom's pot roast simmering on the stove, a family staple that always masked deeper tensions bubbling under the surface, like overcooked gravy threatening to spill over the edges of our carefully maintained facade of normalcy. The evening unfolded in that predictable Jenkins rhythm with Dad Robert, a retired auto parts manager with calloused hands from years at the factory and a perpetual squint from staring at assembly lines under harsh fluorescent lights, grumbling about the latest spike in gas prices while he carved the meat with deliberate slices that echoed his no-nonsense approach to life. Mom Evelyn fluttering around the dining room with her apron tied just so in that way she always did to signal everything was under control even when it clearly wasn't, her smiles tight and measured as she portioned out generous seconds for the golden children Tommy and Lisa, but skimpy helpings for me, as if my appetite was somehow less deserving after all the times I'd skipped meals to stretch the grocery budget during lean months. Tommy at 39 and steadily climbing the ranks at his corporate law firm where he specialized in mergers that sounded as soulless as the boardrooms he navigated, regaled us with detailed tales of closing a big deal that involved late nights in glass towers overlooking the city skyline, his wife absent again on yet another business trip to Chicago that he mentioned with a casual shrug, as if her perpetual travel was just part of the high life. Package while Lisa at 37 and all sharp elbows in her tailored realtor power suit fresh from a day of schmoozing clients over lattes at upscale cafes complained endlessly about picky buyers who nitpicked every detail from crown molding to backyard fencing, shooting me occasional glances that dared me to offer unsolicited advice on staging homes, since I'd always been so good with cleaning up after everyone's messes, a dig that landed with the precision of her commission checks. I played along through the main course, dishing out compliments on the food and refilling water glasses with a practiced efficiency born from years of diner service. But inside, the uncertainty festered like an untreated wound, every family quirk now suspect under the harsh light of the folder's revelations, such as the way Mom always avoided direct eye contact whenever the topic of my adoption came up during rare heart-to-hearts years ago, her voice trailing off into vague assurances of love, or how Dad's old photo album stored in the attic skipped right over my early years, entirely jumping from blank pages filled with nothing but dust to me at 5 years old, looking wary and out of place in a stiff new dress that itched against my skin as if it symbolized the ill fit of my place in their world. As dessert hit the table with the apple pie steaming and aromatic, Lisa dug in with gusto, praising my baking skills in that condescending tone that always made my blood simmer just below the surface, like a pot about to boil over, and I bit back a smirk knowing that the payback hidden in the crust would hit her mid-morning tomorrow during her big open house showing, turning what should have been a triumphant sales pitch into a squirmy ordeal of discomfort, a mild laxative twist clever enough to humble her without drawing suspicion, but potent enough to remind her that the family maid could serve up more than just sweets. Later, after the obligatory hugs that felt hollower than ever, with Dad's pat on my back lingering a second too long as if he sensed the shift in me, and Mom's quick glance away when I mentioned heading home early, I drove back to my apartment, the folder riding shotgun on the passenger seat like an uninvited guest that demanded attention, the unknown call from Connecticut replaying in my head like a looped commercial I couldn't skip or fast forward through, no matter how hard I tried to focus on the familiar glow of streetlights along the highway. Sleep still dodged me that night, the weight of it all pressing down like an invisible hand, so by dawn I was already up and dressed, heading to the local library in Akron, the one with the creaky wooden stacks that smelled of aged paper and forgotten stories, where retirees gathered to escape the world, pulling microfiche reels on cold cases from the 1980s, my waitress uniform hidden under a loose cardigan to blend in like just another curious soul-killing time on a weekday morning. The reels whirred under my fingers, unspooling article after article that matched the clippings in the folder, details of the Hargrove kidnapping painting a vivid picture of privilege I could scarcely imagine, with Richard Hargrove portrayed as the self-made software pioneer who'd turned a modest garage startup into a sprawling tech empire that dominated Silicon Valley knockoffs on the East Coast, and Margaret, his elegant wife, a dedicated philanthropist serving on boards for children's charities. Her public persona one of poised grace, masking the private torment of endless searches funded by the very fortune that spotlighted their loss. One piece in particular caught my eye, a sidebar on copycat abductions from that era, mentioning a couple in the Midwest who had been busted for faking adoptions through shady means, their method involving lures at public parks and forged paperwork to make it all seem legitimate, too close to home for comfort, especially with the Ohio license plate detail from the police reports stirring a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the skipped breakfast or the bitter library coffee I'd grabbed from the vending machine. Humor edged into the dread as I imagined trying to explain this bombshell to Carla over our next shift at the diner, joking about trading in my faded apron for a diamond tiara and a penthouse view, but the growing conflict pressed in relentlessly, because if Mom and Dad had any hand in this, what did that make the entirety of my life an elaborate con job designed to prop up their modest middle-class comfort, while the real me, the one named Emily, had languished in the shadows of their choices, unable to claim the opportunities that should have been mine from the start. I snapped photos of the most relevant articles on my phone, the library's quiet amplifying my ragged breaths and the soft click of the machine like accusations in the stillness, then headed straight to work, where the lunch rush provided a temporary drowning of doubts. In a frenzy of orders for club sandwiches, bottomless coffee refills, and the endless chatter of truckers sharing gripes about everything from union busts to the cost of living that mirrored my own spiraling turmoil in ways that made solidarity feel bittersweet. Tommy texted me mid-shift, inviting me to his upcoming office party next week with a note about networking opportunities, as if my life needed his stamp of approval, but I saw right through the charm laced as always with that undercurrent of obligation, expecting me to show up and play the supportive sister role without question, and that's when the revenge impulse sharpened into something more defined, so I replied with feigned enthusiasm promising to bring my famous deviled eggs, then quietly planned to anonymously tip off his firm's internal newsletter about a surprise tribute to his unsung family supporter, ensuring a slideshow presentation at the event loaded with old embarrassing photos I'd dig up and doctor later to include toddler shots of him in nothing but a diaper and a grin, a clever twist designed to deflate his corporate swagger and level the playing field just a bit without direct confrontation that could backfire on me. It satisfied that deep-seated itch for a measure of justice, a light but pointed jab at his ingrained sense of royalty in our family dynamic. But as my shift wound down and I checked voicemails back in the break room, the library research unexpectedly bore fruit with a digitized police file I'd managed to access through a public database link hinting at a key witness who had recanted their initial statement years ago, buried deep in the archives, but carrying a Jenkins-sounding surname that sent chills racing down my spine. Doubt warred with a surge of excitement as I drove home, the sun dipping low over the industrial skyline, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the ones creeping into my understanding of the past. But the real kicker came that evening when I unpacked the folder once more, spreading it across the kitchen table under the harsh glow of my single overhead bulb, and discovered a faded Polaroid photograph tucked into the back flap, showing me as that toddler from the missing poster perched on a playground swing, my hazel eyes wide with innocent joy. But in the blurred background, a man with a build eerily similar to Dad's lingering by a cluster of trees, his face partially obscured yet unmistakable in posture and stance, as if he'd been caught mid-approach. My heart pounded erratically in my chest, a drumbeat of revelation and fear as I stared at it, willing the image to clarify or disappear. But another call interrupted the moment, this one from Mr. Grant, the lawyer, his tone laced with urgency cutting through the static on the line. And he said, "Sarah, we've run a preliminary DNA match from the sample you provided during our last meeting, and it confirms everything. Your real family is eager to arrange a meeting, but there's something critical you need to know about the rewards fine print that could change how you approach all of this." Mr. Grant's words lingered in the air like exhaust fumes from a idling truck on a cold morning, heavy with implications about the rewards fine print that could unravel not just my future, but the fragile threads holding my past together. So I pressed him for details right there on the phone, my voice edged with the kind of desperation that comes from staring down a cliff you never saw coming. But he hedged, promising an in-person briefing soon to avoid any leaks that could complicate the legal side, leaving me alone in my kitchen with the Polaroid mocking me from the table, its blurred figure of Dad, a silent accusation that twisted my gut into knots, because if he was there at the park, what else had they buried under layers of routine family life and forced smiles at holidays? The uncertainty clawed deeper that night, sleep fracturing into fitful dreams of swings and sedans chasing shadows through playgrounds that blended my Akron childhood with some imagined Connecticut estate. But by morning I shoved it down with black coffee strong enough to strip paint and headed to confront Dad first, figuring his workshop, the one place where tools and truths had always coexisted, would be the safest ground for the storm I was about to unleash, even though deep down I knew his denials might shatter the last illusion of safety I'd clung to for 3 decades, making choices like this feel reckless to anyone watching who might whisper, why not just lawyer up quietly instead of risking the blow-up that could leave me more alone than ever? I chose a quiet Saturday when the sun filtered through the garage windows, casting beams on scattered wrenches and oil-stained rags, the air thick with the scent of motor oil and sawdust that reminded me of simpler fixes, like tuning up my old bike as a kid while Tommy got the new one for his birthday without a second thought, and Dad Robert with his calloused hands from decades on the factory floor, and that perpetual squint honed by staring into engine blocks under flickering lights, handed me a cold soda from the mini fridge, his routine welcome that now felt loaded as I eased into the topic of my adoption story, gently at first circling like a cautious driver on black ice, watching his face for the telltale flinch that betrayed more than words ever could. He chuckled at the start, that deep rumble masking nerves I'd learned to spot from years of reading his moods during tense dinners, but as I slid the Polaroid across the workbench his hands faltered on a half-tightened bolt, eyes flicking away to the far wall where old calendars hung yellowed with time, muttering something about coincidences and how photos from back then were tricky with lighting and angles, nothing solid to pin hopes or fears on. The conflict escalated fast, his defensiveness hardening into pleas not to stir up old ghosts, especially with Tommy's career teetering on partnerships that demanded spotless family reps and Lisa's real estate deals hinging on trust, but I pressed on, voice steady. Despite the quake in my chest, laying out the clippings, details, the Ohio plates, the composite sketch that mirrored Mom's features, forcing him to confront the gaps in their story the way my arrival synced too neatly with a sudden windfall from an uncle's insurance that bought the house upgrades they'd always credited to smart saving. That's when Mom walked in unannounced, her face paling at the sight of the photo, clutched in her apron pocket a yellowed letter sealed and addressed to the Jenkins family from a Connecticut private investigator, dated 1987, unopened, all these years like a time capsule of guilt. She admitted through tears that they'd found me wandering near the park, no parents in sight, just a lost toddler in a sundress, and took me home out of pure kindness after their own struggles with infertility left them desperate for a child, but the light vulgarity of it hit me square. Kindness, my foot more like a desperate grab at normalcy for a couple drowning in bills and barren hopes, though she swore up and down there was no premeditated kidnapping, just a panicked drive back to Ohio before anyone could question their snap decision to keep me, turning what started as rescue into a lifelong deception that explained the skimpy college fund and endless chores as ways to justify the lie to themselves, if not to me. Her breakdown cracked something in Dad, to his shoulders slumping as he confessed to vague regrets about not coming forward sooner, but fear of losing everything, the home, the kids, the stability they'd scraped together, kept them silent, a confession laced with the kind of self-pity that made my blood boil, because their fear had cost me decades of identity and opportunity choices I'd made, like staying loyal through the Maid jokes now seeming foolish to anyone peering in who might judge me for not walking away sooner from a family that treated me like an optional add-on. Lisa and Tommy caught wind of the confrontation by evening, probably from Mom's teary call, storming my apartment in a whirlwind of accusations and demands, Lisa waving printouts of property listings like indictments, warning that any scandal could tank the family home's value and drag their reputations through the mud, while Tommy leaned on the guilt angle hard, reminding me of shared barbecues and holidays, as if his law school tuition hadn't been bankrolled by my unpaid labor around the house there. Subtle blackmail threading through threats of cutting off holiday invites, or the occasional bailout loan I never asked for but always accepted out of habit, a dynamic that fueled the fire in my veins, turning simmering resentment into a plan for payback that felt as inevitable as the next diner rush. The opportunity arose at Dad's birthday barbecue the following weekend, a backyard gathering with neighbors firing up the grill, potato salad in Tupperware, and the air buzzing with small talk about local sports teams and weather patterns, where I volunteered to handle the slideshow tribute, a digital setup on the laptop projecting old family photos for nostalgia's sake, but I layered in the revenge with clever edits slipping in composites from the clippings next to Tommy's corporate headshots, blurring lines just enough to spark whispers among the guests about that familiar face from old news stories, watching him pale mid-toast as questions bubbled up from curious aunts and uncles, turning his spotlight moment into a public embarrassment that had him deflecting with forced laughs, a witty exposure of his polished facade without naming names outright, satisfying that deep craving for equity in a way that left him rattled and me with a secret smile, though it probably struck outsiders as petty escalation over family drama. Humor crept in later that night as I debriefed with Carla over takeout pizza in my living room, quipping about turning barbecues into cold case reenactments, but the atmosphere thickened with relentless conflict clues dropping like forgotten keys, Mom's letter detailing a blue sedan witness that matched the reports perfectly, and my resurfacing nightmares now vivid with Dad's voice calling from the trees, a pull toward the truth that warred with the pull of loyalty. The growing tension peaked midweek as I mulled over the letters, faded ink staining my fingers like indelible proof, while picking at leftover fries from the diner. My phone lit up with the Connecticut area code again, this time Margaret Hargrove's voice breaking through Clear and laced with 3 decades of raw longing. Sarah, or Emily, we've dreamed of this moment every single day, but there's a complication with Richard. He's not the steadfast man from those posters anymore, his health crumbling under the weight of secrets and the reward. It's entangled in family matters you won't believe, pulling me toward a revelation that dangled just out of reach. Margaret's voice trailed off into a promise of a private meeting, her words carrying the weight of invitations to estates I'd only seen in glossy magazines, but laced with that complication about Richard that hung like a storm cloud over the line, making me grip the phone tighter as if I could squeeze out more details before she hung up, leaving me in the dim glow of my apartment lamp staring at the scattered clippings that now felt like puzzle pieces from someone else's life, forcing me to question every choice that had led me here, from the endless diner shifts that paid just enough to keep the lights on to the family obligations I'd shouldered without complaint, all while the truth simmered beneath the surface, like a pot left too long on the burner ready to boil over and scorch everything in its path. The uncertainty deepened overnight, blending with the relentless conflict of what to do next, because claiming the reward sounded like a ticket out of my hand-to-mouth existence, but the fine print Mr. Grant had teased hinted at strings attached that could pull me into a web of legal battles and family feuds, leaving me more entangled than before, a dilemma that made my decision to push forward feel like tempting fate in a way that anyone listening might call foolish, when walking away quietly could preserve the fragile peace I'd known, even if it was built on sand. I couldn't shake the pull toward answers, so the next day, after a morning rush of hash browns and small talk with regulars griping about healthcare costs that echoed my own fears of what this revelation might unearth, I dipped into my meager savings to hire a private investigator. Marty Klein, a grizzled ex-cop from Cleveland with a voice like gravel over the phone and rates that made my stomach twist, but his no-nonsense reputation from online forums promised discretion in digging up the dirt. I couldn't touch myself, his initial retainer check written on a trembling hand as I sat at my kitchen table, the same one littered with Hargrove headlines that now seemed to mock my blue-collar reality. Marty's first report arrived via encrypted email a few days later, detailing dead ends in the official kidnapping file, but flagging glaring inconsistencies in my parents' timelines, like Dad's unexplained 2-week leave from the factory right after the disappearance date coinciding with a cross-state drive he'd always attributed to a fishing trip that now reeked of cover story, and Mom's sudden aversion to news broadcasts in the late 80s, which she dismissed as headaches, but Marty suspected was avoidance of the very coverage that could have exposed them. The light vulgarity of it all struck me as I read under the hum of my fridge, opportunists in over their heads, turning a desperate act into a lifelong charade, but the growing conflict pressed harder, because if they were pawns in something bigger, what did that make the Hargroves the benevolent saviors or architects of a deeper scheme that the reward masked? Navigating the legal labyrinth meant a tense drive to Mr. Grant's office in downtown Columbus, the skyscrapers rising like judgmental sentinels over my rusting sedan, where traffic snarled with horns blaring frustrations that matched my own as I parked and climbed the stairs to his corner suite overlooking the river, the air inside crisp with the scent of polished wood and fresh legal pads. Over lukewarm coffee in china cups that felt too delicate for my callous fingers, he laid out the reward's intricate fine print, requiring not just DNA confirmation, which we'd already fast-tracked through a discreet lab, but a public acknowledgement as Emily Hargrove, heir to the empire, opening floodgates to potential lawsuits from my adoptive family claiming emotional distress or unjust enrichment, plus the tangled politics within the Hargroves, where Richard's declining health from a long battle with some undisclosed illness left boardroom rivals circling ready to claw back portions of the payout if I didn't endorse their rebranding efforts to polish the company's image amid whispers of ethical lapses in early contracts that built their billions. The dilemma hit like a gut punch: take the cash under the radar and vanish to a quiet life, maybe a cottage by Lake Erie where I could finally breathe, without the weight of 2 families, or fight publicly for the full truth, risking countersuits that could strip me bare and alienate the very people who'd raised me, a choice so fraught with moral quicksand that it made me second-guess my impulse to hire Marty in the first place, the audience, in my mind, perhaps shaking their heads at the recklessness of stirring this hornet's nest when reconciliation offered a softer landing, even if it meant swallowing the lies whole. Marty called mid-meeting with a fresh lead, an old neighbor from my parents' early days in Ohio, a widow named Gladys, who'd babysat Tommy before I arrived, willing to talk off the record about seeing the Jenkins with a new kid, a confused toddler who cried for days straight. Her story laced with pity for the little girl who clutched a gold locket like a lifeline, only for Mom to pawn it weeks later, a detail that matched the missing child description in the clippings down to the engraved initials EH. That now burned in my memory as proof of the theft. Back home, that evening the impending revenge brewed during a forced family counseling session Mom had insisted on, in a beige office smelling of artificial lavender from a plug-in diffuser, her eyes pleading for unity as we sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, Tommy fidgeting with his tie and Lisa tapping her foot in impatience, airing grievances about my recent attitude, which was code for my probing questions that threatened their carefully curated narratives. I stayed silent at first, letting their complaints pile up like unpaid bills, then flipped the script with a clever ploy, slipping the therapist a pre-written note about forgotten family heirlooms, prompting targeted questions that zeroed in on the locket's disappearance, watching Lisa squirm and deflect with increasingly thin excuses until she bolted from the room, her realtor composure cracking under the pressure, a witty deflection that exposed cracks without me lifting a finger, satisfying the itch for payback in a way that left them off balance and me with a quiet thrill, though it probably came off as manipulative to outsiders, weighing whether family therapy should heal or harm. Humor edged in as I texted Carla the play-by-play, later quipping about turning shrinks into sleuths, but the atmosphere hung thick with uncertainty. Marty's next update by a voicemail revealing Dad's blue sedan had been repainted shortly after the kidnapping, a damning alteration tied to a body shop receipt he'd buried in old tax files, a clue that wove the threads tighter around their guilt. As the weeks blurred into a rhythm of investigations and avoidance, the growing tension built to a head at Lisa's big open house for a lakeside property, a showcase event with champagne flutes and potential buyers milling about in khakis and pearls, where I showed up uninvited, blending into the crowd with a borrowed name tag reading prospective client Emily Hargrove, dropping subtle asides to fellow agents about family history in Connecticut parks that sowed seeds of doubt and curiosity, watching her sweat through her sales pitch as whispers spread, a revenge layered with delicious irony that humbled her entitlement without a direct word from me, turning the event into her personal unraveling. It felt empowering, a clever strike at the heart of her royalty complex, but as I slipped away into the evening dusk, my phone buzzing with Margaret's follow-up message about sending a car for the meeting, the real cliffhanger dropped with Marty's urgent text: evidence points to your adoptive folks not acting alone. There's a money trail leading right back to a Hargrove rival, and it smells like an inside job. Marty's text burned in my pocket like a lit fuse during the drive south, the sleek black limo from the Hargroves gliding along interstate lanes under a sky bruised with autumn clouds that mirrored the storm churning inside me as I clutched the folder now bulging with his latest notes on that money trail, snaking from my parents' modest bank deposits to a shadowy Hargrove rival, a corporate shark named Victor Lang who'd feuded with Richard over early patents and might have orchestrated the whole kidnapping as leverage in a boardroom war, turning what I'd thought was random desperation into a calculated plot that made my skin crawl with the vulgarity of it all. Big money playing God with little lives, while I footed the bill in chores and skipped dreams. The uncertainty peaked with every milepost, the dilemma of whether to spill this to Margaret upon arrival or hold it close like a bargaining chip, weighing against the pull of belonging to a family that had grieved publicly for decades, a choice that felt selfish even to me, as if I were choosing secrets over salvation, leaving anyone following this saga to wonder why I didn't just demand transparency from the start instead of layering on more layers of deceit in a bid for control. The Hargrove estate unfolded like a scene from those aspirational home tours on cable TV, manicured lawns stretching to a mansion with white columns and ivy-cloaked walls where staff in crisp uniforms ushered me through marble-floored halls echoing with the ghosts of galas and board meetings, into a sunlit study lined with mahogany bookshelves groaning under leather-bound volumes of business tomes and family albums that promised the legacy I'd been denied. Richard waited there, frail in a leather armchair, his once imposing frame shrunken by illness, a stroke they'd later confide that left him sharp but sidelined, his handshake trembling as he confirmed the DNA match with a nod to the lab report on the desk, his voice gravelly with decades of bottled regret over the lost years, the playground picnics and bedtime stories stolen in a blink, while Margaret hovered nearby, her designer scarf draped elegantly over shoulders that had carried charity galas and private vigils, her eyes welling as she pulled me into a hug that smelled of lavender and old money, painting a portrait of relentless searches funded by empire profits now teetering on the edge of scandal, the kind that tabloids would devour if it broke wide. The revelation unfolded in measured confessions over tea served in porcelain that clinked like fragile nerves, Richard admitting the kidnapping bore hallmarks of sabotage by Lang, who'd planted the Ohio couple as unwitting proxies, paying them hush money through shell accounts that Marty had traced to explain the unopened PI letter and pawned locket, a corporate grudge from the 80s when Hargrove Industries crushed a rival startup, leaving Lang bankrupt and vengeful enough to strike at the heart by snatching the heir. Conflicts erupted as I laid out my evidence, the room thickening with crossed accusations and defensive postures, Margaret revealing the reward's true entanglements, requiring not just my endorsement of the family legacy, but active involvement in rebranding Hargrove Industries to bury those early ethical lapses like under-the-table bribes and patent thefts that had ballooned their billions, a moral quagmire where claiming the $91 million meant becoming complicit in the very machine that had orphaned me twice over, washing clean the sins that might have indirectly caused my disappearance. My adoptive family crashed the fragile peace via a frantic video call Dad initiated from their living room, the screen flickering with their faces, Mom Evelyn sobbing apologies for the mistake of silence born from fear after Lang's anonymous tip-off that painted them as heroes if they just kept quiet, Tommy barking threats of countersuits to safeguard his partnerships and the home equity they'd built on my back, Lisa venomous about my greed appending lives we'd scraped together, but the full truth clawed out in fragments, Dad's halting confession of spotting me in the park, a split-second lure prompted by a desperate note from Lang promising cash for a foundling that snowballed into deception when no one came forward, their infertility and factory woes blinding them to the cost, a revelation laced with self-justification that ignited my fury because their cowardice had scripted my maid's life while Lang pulled strings from afar. Emotions crested in a torrent, my choices under merciless fire, forgive and fold into this fractured wealth, or expose the web dragging everyone down a path so vengeful it isolated me further as I withheld Marty's rival link from Margaret, a decision born of distrust that now echoed hollow, leaving the room to judge whether loyalty or truth should win, even as Richard offered the check in a velvet folder, its zeros gleaming like a siren's call. The final revenge took shape during a mediated summit brokered by Mr. Grant back in neutral Ohio, at a lakeside conference center with lake winds whipping through open windows carrying the scent of pine and unresolved grudges, where I orchestrated a reconciliation slideshow projected for both families, adoptive and biological, blending digitized clippings, home videos, and Marty's timelines into a narrative mosaic highlighting hypocrisies like Lisa's luxury vacations juxtaposed with my diner logs and Tommy's mergers against Dad's hush payments, ending with a free-frame family tree branching into redacted question marks over Lang's name, a clever digital expose that tied loose ends without courtrooms, forcing gasps from Richard's side and blushes from mine as Mom collapsed in tears and Tommy fumbled excuses, the witty closure leveling hierarchies in a flash of pixels that satisfied the burning need for accountability, turning the gathering into a mirror of deceptions revealed. Humor flickered through the chaos, a bitter chuckle escaping as I quipped to Carla later about slideshows as truth bombs, but the atmosphere clung heavy with uncertainty, the reward folder heavy in my lap as rain lashed the windows and families dispersed into splintered silences, Richard's plea for alliance ringing against Marty's final whisper of ongoing cover-ups, suggesting Lang's shadow still lurked, perhaps embedded in the Hargrove board itself. In the end, I walked from the center's drive, the limo idling with offers of escape, the $91 million a fork between vanishing to rebuild in anonymity or torching it publicly for raw justice, risking isolation and audits that could strip bare the remnants of both worlds. Did I cash the check, embracing a tainted fortune to heal old wounds, or shred it in defiance, leaving the ghosts to wander, a deliberate ambiguity that hangs like fog over the lake, urging you to ponder if wealth mends the fractures of stolen lives or merely gilds the cracks, letting them spider wider unseen?